If I could ask everyone to take a seat, we're just about ready to get started. Let me welcome you all to the Wilson Center. Delighted to see so many people early in the morning. My name's Kent Hughes. I run a program here on science, technology, America, and the global economy. And this, of course, is the start of two very rich days. We're going to be looking at key elements in approaching the energy and climate change questions. Before I go any further, it's my pleasure to introduce the president of the Wilson Center, Lee Hamilton. You have a bio in your kit, so I'll be very brief. I want to warn everyone that we should never, despite 34 years of representing Indiana in the House, he's very sensitive about being referred to as an Indianian. It's a Hoosier. Everyone needs to remember that. And during his Hill service, Mr. Hamilton served as chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, chairman of the Joint Economic Committee. The harder the question, the more likely Lee Hamilton was to be involved, whether it was ethics, whether it was Iran-Contra, and a whole host of other responsibilities. He has built and strengthened the center since he's been here. Our latest edition is a Kissinger Institute on Chinese-U.S. Studies. It has just been a great pleasure to work here for Mr. Hamilton. When you talk about Midwestern values, you have a walking example right here. Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ken. It's always helpful to be introduced by a person whose paycheck you sign.
And I haven't gotten it yet this month.
Well, come up here and take another crack at it, and say a little more if you would. Yeah. Thank you very much, Kent, for your introduction. It's a pleasure to see all of you here. We are at the Wilson Center delighted to be working again with the Baker Public Policy Center at the Wilson Center on this conference, formulating a bipartisan national energy and climate policy. We've had several collaborations with the Baker Center over a period of years, and they've just been hugely successful from our standpoint. And of course, it's a high privilege to work with all of them at the center, and especially, of course, with Senator Baker. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. I work at the Wilson Center. I get a bonus whenever I quote Woodrow Wilson. I'm going to give you two quotes that I use frequently, and if I can think of a third, I may throw that one in too. He said that he uses all of the brains he has and all he could borrow. That's a very good comment about a session like this. Got a very talented group of people in front of us here, and a lot of brain power, but all of us know the issues that we're dealing with are such that no one of us can comprehend all aspects of it. So we try to use all the brain power that we have and all we can borrow in a session like this, and we come away from it, all of us benefiting. Now, the second quotation is not quite as good. He said, I always feel sorry, Mr. Wilson said, I always feel sorry for those who disagree with me, because I know they're wrong. And that's the type of attitude you don't want to bring here to this meeting. We try to follow the Wilsonian example. All of you know that he was a very distinguished political scientist. Indeed, I think if you were to put down the five greatest political scientists this country has produced, most of us would put Wilson in that category. He wrote a lot of books. One very famous one, as Howard knows, on congressional committees, before he became president of Princeton and then governor of New Jersey and eventually president. He always had this tension between academia on the one hand, a superb scholar, and politics and government on the other. And when he was engaged in one, he felt the tug and tension of wanting to engage in the other. We try to honor that legacy as a man of scholarship and of course, public policy, and we do our best here in over 800 meetings a year to bring together scholars and politicians so that the interaction between the two will, we hope, produce in time better policy. Your discussions today and tomorrow focus on energy and climate change, but more specifically, as I understand it, you focus on process, system thinking, and the development of a framework for broad participation. These are essential, often I think neglected aspects of our policymaking process. Ideas matter a great deal, but so does promoting and building support for them. Now I have the very real pleasure of introducing Howard Baker. He's served this country in so many ways, I'm not going to try to catalog it here. Let me just sum it up and say that by any measure, he is one of the really great public servants of, if I may say so, my somewhat aging generation. Howard was elected to the Senate in 1966, served with great distinction until his retirement in 1985. He served both as Majority Leader in the Senate and also Minority Leader. He served as President Reagan's Chief of Staff, and in 2001, he became the United States Ambassador to Japan, I think our 26th ambassador there. He is now, of course, Senior Counsel at Baker, Donaldson, Bierman, Caldwell, and Berkowitz. And we're just delighted to have Howard with us and leading this group today. Howard?
Lee Hamilton, thank you very much. It's always a distinct pleasure to be on any platform with Lee Hamilton. I've done it a number of times in different configurations. I've always come away better for having done it and inspired for the future. I was particularly impressed, Lee, that you have 800 meetings a year at the Wilson Center. That is mind-boggling. It is also commendable and an example for us all. The Baker Center at the University of Tennessee is fairly new, very new, as a matter of fact. We've just taken occupancy of our new building on the main campus of the University in Knoxville. It's a beautiful building at the entrance to the campus, big building. But most of all, my friends, it has that wonderful paid-for look. In case you don't understand what I'm saying, we raised the money to build it and paid for it. Now, the government put up a small amount of money for an endowment. It is not beyond the realm of possibility that we'll ask them to put up some more. But not now, not today. We're doing fine. Our interim director is here. Carl, you're in the room, I think. And on loan from the University of Tennessee Law School, our director, who was the opening director, Alan Lowe, did a magnificent job and has been quietly stolen by the Bush 43 Library in Texas. And they did well. They really did. And I regret to see him leave, but he'll do a good job for them as well. The Baker Center's off and running. We've had a number of great programs. We're pleased with them. We published extensively on those programs and otherwise, and we intend to continue. But the one that we're faced with now today is terribly important in my view, not only because of the substance, but because of the continuing association with the Wilson Center and with Lee Hamilton. It's a matter of personal pride to me that we're doing that, not only because it's an appropriate thing to do here, but because I have a special respect, even reverence, for Lee Hamilton and for the Wilson Center. I have forgotten how many we've had, but we've had a number of events together. This is another of the series, and I'm delighted that we have the opportunity to continue. Our first event was a roundtable of distinguished former public figures who have served the White House and the Cabinet and the Congress who shared their experiences and insights, creating comprehensive national policy. It sounds like a pretty amorphous charge, but my friends, it was remarkably stimulating. And I should have anticipated that, being in the category at least of past public servants, because I'm aware of the personal tradition that former public servants have strong views, sometimes to the exclusions of other people's views. But it was a pleasure to do that. We were reminded of the admonition of Pat Moynihan, who once famously observed that we have separate opinions, but we do not have separate facts. And that's important to remember, and is not always remembered. Getting the facts right is really about getting the process right. And that, my friends, is why we're here today. We thank our partners. They are distinguished partners, and we're very grateful that they would participate. For the Sandia Laboratories, Lawrence Livermore, the Bush School of Public Policy at Texas A&M, and others. These are important contributors. They add luster to this program, and they are particularly welcome today. We also have a speaker coming for a keynote address later that I will speak of when he arrives. But Dan Poneman is presently a distinguished public servant. He is also one that Lee Hamilton and I have worked with in the past, who has a perspective and judgment that is unrivaled in the energy field, and I'm sure you'll enjoy that. My friends, I cannot think of a soul that would be better qualified to handle this program than Lee Hamilton. I have to guard against being unduly lyrical about my descriptions of Lee. He was a great member of the House. I forgive him for seeing the misnomer on his label, on his sign down here. It said Senator Hamilton. He quickly pointed out he was not a senator, ever. And as George Aiken once said, he was not a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, nor any other subversive group. But Lee has made a career of being a great American and a great participant, but it is unparalleled in his experience here today as the director of the Wilson Center. As I say, he is an example for us all. I continue to be impressed by what he does and grateful for the opportunity. And now, my friends, I'll turn it back over to Kip. Thank you, sir. I'll stay up here. Flattered.
Yeah.
We are doubly blessed this morning. We had a wonderful introduction by two outstanding public servants. And we also, because this is such a serious set of questions, we are blessed with two keynote speakers, two top individuals who I think will prompt our thinking and lay a path for us to proceed for the rest of the 2 days. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Nick Mabey. Nick, would you like to come on up? Nick is currently the founding director and the chief executive of E3G. So all these new companies have fancy names that are somewhat impenetrable. Before founding E3G, he served as a senior advisor in the United Kingdom's Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, where he had an incredibly broad portfolio that ranged from fisheries to organized crime, showing that he was not afraid to swim in troubled waters.
Oh, boy. You had to do that.
I know that paycheck may be in danger after that. Maybe, not surprisingly, has a distinguished academic background. He is both an engineer and an economist. You know, he brings a sense of how things work and how much they cost, in a sense how to move them from the laboratory all the way to the living room. He's served as head of the economics department at WWF UK and is in great demand, and as a result serves on quite a number of advisory boards. In many ways, he is a Woodrow Wilson clone, combining periods of research with in-the-trenches policymaking. He'll speak to us for about half an hour and then has agreed to take a few minutes of questions. Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Senator and Woodrow Wilson Centre and the Baker Centre for inviting me here. It's a great honour to be able to speak and to speak on something that I managed to combine the whole of my rather strange career into one presentation. Yeah, I feel that none of my strange wayward jobs have been wasted when I get to present this. My task here partly is to make sure you don't fall asleep in an early-ish morning meeting, certainly early for Europe, is also to give a kind of overview of how this often kind of arcane idea of systems thinking can be used in real government. And I'm going to do that by giving a very impressionistic, brief overview of some of the work I was involved with in the UK government, and also how that, and some ideas of how that can be taken forward in the area of energy and climate change. When I put the slides up, and there's far too many of them, they're not meant to be studied in great detail except when I stop. They're really just, some of them are just, we used to call them, shock and awe presentations. Just a feeling for the kind of amount of data underlying things, and then hopefully how you can bring that into a rather more simpler, policy-relevant conclusion so that people who actually make real decisions might actually listen to you, which was always one of the main purposes of what we did in the strategy unit. If it wasn't downloadable in 2 minutes to the Prime Minister, you tended not to make a lot of impressions, and you tended not to get invited back to number 10 very often. So a lot of what I'm going to say is born out of hard experience. There's a lot of my own personal failures and challenges that have gone into some of the judgments in here, but I'm really interested to get people's feedback, because this is a very growing and experiential field. We haven't got any of the answers, but hopefully we're starting to get some of the questions right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a brief introduction to myself and what I do, a brief introduction to the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, which is where I've stolen a lot of this material, then go into what I think systems thinking is for in day-to-day government, give you some examples which range from fisheries to energy, and there's not actually a lot of difference between fisheries and organised crime in much parts of the world. They tend to actually be quite interlocking sectors. The codfather used to be one of the bad puns we used in our work. I did actually have to have a police escort when I did some of the stakeholder outreach to fishing communities. And then I'm going to talk about how some of these experience might lead us to define problem areas in energy and climate, and then a return back to the real world and say, well, that's all fine in theory, but what does it mean in practice, and what are some of the things that those people involved in running real policy systems need to do on their end to ensure this kind of rich systems information can actually be used in practice. So both the demand and supply side of information and policy making. So a quick description of E3G, which is what I run at the moment. We're a non-profit, public interest organisation in Europe, but we work globally. Our mission is to accelerate the transition to sustainable development, so we're interested in making things happen. And the reason we set it up was because all the founders worked in government and industry and NGOs and academia, and we realised that getting things to happen is not that easy, and we work across many sectors. And my background, as said, I've worked in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, I've worked in the Foreign Office, I've worked in research and in NGOs. Again, one of the main things is seeing how you translate across disciplinary boundaries. I had an intern arrive recently. I said, what's your background? He said, well, I started off in anthropology, but now I've moved to do ecological science. It's much more relevant. I'm saying, no, anthropology is far more relevant for the work we do, because we're constantly trying to deal with different tribes of professionals and policymakers and making them understand each other. And actually, ecology is virtually pointless, actually, in the stuff we do. So, kind of stick with your old degree. The Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, what is it? Unit of the Cabinet Office, which loosely translates to something like the National Security Council and a bit of the West Wing. Founded when the Labour government came in 1997. It's a central capacity for strategic, long-term and cross-cutting thinking, And it's also got a role to promote strategic thinking and better policy making across Her Majesty's government, for those who don't know HMG. It runs from the Cabinet. As times have changed, it has more or less Cabinet support or more or less Prime Ministerial support, depending on the relationships inside the Cabinet. But essentially it's commissioned by the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to do work. It works in teams, it undertakes commission projects that last 3 to 9 months, and quite uniquely for especially the UK, it brings together teams of civil servants, academics, public sector and other governments, and it's very open in the way it works. It publishes some reports, it keeps lots of reports private, it has some which have both dual aspects. And the product goes back into government as either a set of recommendations or as a white paper, which is real policy, and it depends on how many people you've annoyed during the process, whether your work's taken out. So systems thinking in day-to-day government. The reality, and John Maynard Keynes is always good for reality. There is nothing a government hates more than to be well informed. For it takes the process of arriving at decisions much more complicated and difficult. And any of you who have actually had deadlines to make real decisions know that truth. So the first thing is, coming to people and saying, I'm going to make your decision-making process more complicated, doesn't generally tend to get you a good welcome. And I must admit, there's a problem with systems thinkers. They turn up with big models, and people look at them and go, not really, thanks very much. It's very, very interesting. Now let's get back to pointing down to the decision. So if that's the reality, what's systems thinking and how does it relate to this? Well, this isn't systems thinking. This is my simple model of linear thinking. A leads to B leads to C. Most economics tries to be like that. Some engineering tries to be like that. Systems thinking just says it's a bit more complicated. Sometimes you have loops from B to C and feed forward, and sometimes feed back. That's the whole of systems theory. That's the end of the systems theory lesson. What does that do to the world? It makes it really non-intuitive. Boom and bust cycles. We know about boom and bust cycles. We've had a bit of experience about non-intuitive system behaviour in the financial sector. Oh gosh, people didn't behave as we thought they would, and some of those loops of risk management didn't quite manage risk. And so systems control must include all elements. And I think the financial crisis is actually an extremely good example of all of the features of a system which was badly controlled because people made assumptions about how it worked which weren't actually based in reality. So at a trivial level, everything is a system. But what really matters is, when do we have to consider systems characteristics to make good policy? That's the critical piece. When do we have to get complicated to solve the problem? Because if you can be simple, be simple. That's, politics is complicated enough to make the policy complicated. So why? So why use systems thinking? Quite simple, really. Help us make better decisions. To map unintended consequences, probably one of the most important pieces. Unintended consequences, you don't get all of them, but let's try and get some of them. Then in process terms, to counter tendency to silo or departmental thinking actually ends up in the examples you see. This is one of the key things you do with systems thinking. And lastly, to communicate assumptions and policies to stakeholders. If you can't say it clearly, you can't build support. So you have to push it through with power. Very wasteful of your political capital. Part of the job of the Prime Minister's strategy in it was to minimise the calls on the Prime Minister's political capital to solve problems. So if we could win the argument, he didn't have to use some of his capital. That, I saw, was my main job. To build that constituency and consensus, and then if I had to use him, he could come in and make it happen, and put a ribbon on the top and make the announcement. But if I had to come back and say, well, you need to do some really heavy lifting here, I've failed in part of my job. And the reality is, the speed of policy cycles and the complexity of issues means that a broad understanding of systems concepts, that things happen and feedbacks and those matters as much as full models. This interaction between very detailed analysis and making it live in policy making is the key nexus here. And for those who live in the real world, again, let's just be clear that systems thinking only works in some cases. It works, and this is a nice thing, on the knowable place where cause and effect is separated in space and time, so you can't automatically, you don't know what's going to happen, but it's knowable. This is very Rumsfeldian, partly because the people who did it used to advise Donald Rumsfeld about known and unknown issues, but it doesn't work so well in complex or chaotic sectors where different tools need to be applied. And a lot of issues that deal with public opinion and expectation have complex pieces. So you have to be quite aware of the limits and kind of be wise in the use of these tools, because, again, any tool, if badly used, is dangerous to the policymaker. So that's three-size systems thinking 101, but how does it work in the real world? 4 examples. Fisheries policy, correctional services, also known as prisons, but that's a nice way of talking about it. Countries at risk of instability, also known as failing states, it's a nice way of talking about it. And energy and climate security. These are all projects which we did at the strategy unit. They all resulted in real policy and they all involved real politics. And I'm just going to give a flip through about what they were about and what we took as lessons from these areas. So starting with fisheries, which was the least important but the most complicated and difficult project I ever did. Made organised crime look quite easy, actually, in some ways. This was done, what happened was we had a massive collapse in quotas, so the whole fishing industry went to see the Prime Minister, and he said, we'll do a strategy. And then they pulled me in and said, would you mind doing a fisheries strategy? And I said, fine. I said, you sure? It's like, not known. And so a year and a half later, we produced a report, which was then partially implemented over the next few years, and I'm happy to explain why partially and who we won and who we didn't win. But what were we doing? Well, basically, the UK has a lot of fish, 80 commercial species, which go forward, and we have not that many fishermen, around 12,000, 20,000, but they've been falling. We've been losing fishermen over time, and all our fishing communities are dispersed, rural and poor. The kind of red dots show people who are very dependent on fisheries and dispersed wide around the country. The most important thing is the third bullet point. They have more members of parliament per job than any other industry. Because if you're scattered all the way around the coast, you are in everybody's constituency. So they are incredible. They're smaller than the lawnmower industry, but they have an ability to catch headlines and run political debates you would not believe. So, if it was just an industrial policy issue, we wouldn't be doing it. Unfortunately for them, the red bar of endangered stocks in the European Union have been going up over time, not very good management. And we asked them, what do you think is happening? And they all said, the whole system is broken. We don't believe the system works as survey results. We don't think you're measuring the fish right. We don't think the ministers are making the right decisions. We don't think you're enforcing right. We don't think the fishermen are complying. We think you're putting too many subsidies in. But all the different stakeholders believe different bits of the pie. So the fishermen blame the scientists, and the scientists blame the fishermen, and the NGOs blame the government, and well, actually everybody blamed the government. So we end up with, how do we solve this problem? Very difficult interlock problem. Simple questions. Always good to have simple questions. What are the causes of fisheries management failures? If fisheries were well managed, what would a sustainable fleet look like? That's also nice. How many cuts do we need to make to get a sustainable fleet? Which is why I needed the police escort. Because I was telling them it was actually a rather larger number than the fishermen wanted. What would a reformed management system look like? At the UK and EU level, the opposition party, the Conservatives, wanted to pull out of the whole fisheries policy, so that was not an unpolitical issue, talking about European fisheries policies. And how would you actually get there? And it took us 12 months, 5 system models, 100 stakeholder meetings, and 4 national jurisdictional debates and negotiations, because this has devolved competence across the whole of England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and the devolved parties, nationalist parties in those areas, also have very strong links to fishing, so they just didn't want to agree anything because it was England asking them to do things. So, again, very key politics. So what did we do? We did lots of modelling. We did modelling of fish stocks and how they went up and down, and we did modelling of how the fleet goes up and down, and we did modelling of how the fleet works. It's all great, this stuff. And we even modelled how compliance worked. So, if you put fines on fishermen, what do they do and when do they go out of business? And what came out of that was a set of cycles of hard and soft failure. We had a cycle of misreporting. Because fishermen didn't report their catches right, the scientists said, there's more risk around the catches, so I'll set the limits lower. So the limits were lower and the fishermen misreported even more. It's one of those cycles. There was a cycle of mistrust where the reluctance of the scientists to admit they couldn't measure the fish stocks very well, and the hostility of the fishermen to working with them because they thought they were part of the compliance system, meant that the divergence between what the model said and what reality was kept on diverging and continually ended up with this mistrust. We had a cycle of overinvestment where the subsidies to reduce fleet size actually ended up modernising it and making it fewer boats but actually capable of catching more. And the fact that mostly small businesses, and they used their house to back the loan for the boat, meant that if the quota was set low, they still had to pay their mortgage. So they just went out and fished anyway. Again, looking at incentives right at the issue, that's where systems really come in. And a cycle of non-compliance where we raised fines and increased enforcement, And it just put the more honest fishermen out of business because the guys who were really cheating could afford to pay the fines. So there was an unintended consequence if you wanted one. And the fact that it wasn't just they thought they were, the EU and fisheries authorities weren't competent. They actually didn't believe they cared about the industry or the environment. There was actually a disbelief in intention. And the bureaucratic views in return were pretty hard line as well. Fishermen not obeying the rules is a criminal offence. This is, and we went across Europe and talked to all the fishing authorities, and this is a summary. They're undermining fish stocks and their own livelihoods, therefore they must be irrational, irresponsible, and congenitally dishonest. Fishermen are hunters. They are different to normal people. Was one of, I mean, this is policy by stereotype at a level which. But that's a real quote from a continental country not that far from Britain. Fishermen cannot be trusted to co-manage fish stocks with the authorities, but every single aid agency in Europe has been doing co-management in the developing world with fishermen for 30 years, including the UK. So we trust Thai fishermen to be rational, but not European fishermen. I thought I loved that. That was one of my favourites. And if you actually have a discussion that what are the incentives for non-compliance with the policies, you're giving them excuses for breaking the law. Which is true, because I was used in court to try and get some people off some fines, but it was like, no, we can't even talk about this issue. I was warned by the Permanent Secretary of the Fisheries Fund, don't even talk about this issue. Because if you talk about it, you're basically breaking down the whole system. So their answer, the bureaucratic answer was more enforcement, better science, and better fishermen. And in fact, some of them did want to get rid of all the fishermen and start again with corporate fleets. We must need more control. Slight problem. If you look at the balance sheet of the UK fisheries industry, the government's spending as much as the profits on the stuff they declare. There's a little more profit in the illegal sector, in fact, quite a lot more profit. You can't spend all your value added in industry on regulation. You just can't do command and control with those costs. So it's too expensive to control. So what did we come up with? Well, what we tried to do is take those cycles of mistrust and replace them. So what we wanted to do is create a virtuous circle around profits, that we gave people enough profit that they could invest in new technology and savings for the bad years. That meant cutting the fleet size, which is not popular, but we needed to get profits up. But no one would talk about profits when we first started. We need to get the information unbiased, so we need to create trust between the scientists and the fishermen that they actually knew what was going on. We needed to get the capital in the fleet aligned with the fish stocks. And most crucially, we needed to create a culture of compliance. I mean, this is like soft drugs. No one cared about not complying. There was a complete breakdown of social contract. It was not considered socially unacceptable not to comply with the rules because the societies and communities involved did not believe they were right. And we needed to rebuild that trust that the system was worth supporting. So compliance is a norm and enforcement an exception. So what did we learn the overall from this? That we needed a lot of systems models, yes. We needed to look at a lot of the numbers because underlying we had to convince the stakeholders we understood this space and we understood what was going to happen. And the key issue was we couldn't afford to run the system the way we thought the government wanted to run it. Transaction costs were too high. And that we had to admit we didn't know what was going on. That with climate change, with global markets, with oil prices, massive impact on the profitability of fishing, we needed enormous uncertainty. So we actually needed to trust each other between the industry, the scientists and the regulators to actually be able to manage this uncertainty. And that we need to constantly invest in innovation and not claim we had a perfect system in order to do that. So, in a sense, this was one of those areas where lots of modelling showed the limits of what we know. And what it motivated was investment in a high-trust system that could learn how to do things better. So a good example of where your direct answer is not perhaps what you're doing.
Nick, could I break in for just a moment? We've had suddenly a typical Washington chaotic complexity.
I'm going to have to learn, aren't I? And be flexible.
Could I ask you to yield in the middle of this? And we just got word that Secretary Poneman, who is here, has to rush out the door and be at the White House at 10:40, I think. 10:45. So maybe we'll have him to 10:40. Would you mind if I brought him to the stage? And we'll return to...
You see, there you are. I think that proves my whole point. Hey, I worked in government. Knocked off a podium was very normal. Shall I close down?
I'm a little intimidated having heard that reference to the Codfather. But
I didn't say it was without consequences.
Secretary Poneman, can I ask you to come up?
How you doing?
Well, we're enormously privileged to have Secretary Poneman with us. He has served with distinction on the National Security Council and a number of other high-level positions. He has been a senior figure with the Scowcroft Group, and we all have enormous respect for General Scowcroft. Not taking a second more time, Secretary Poneman, the floor is yours. He is in demand. He's rushed here from cut an earlier speaking engagement short. Just got word that he's expected in the White House, so we're delighted that he was able to squeeze us in a systematic way, I think.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your kind and suitably brief introduction. And when I got an invitation that had the names Lee Hamilton and Howard Baker attached to it, I could not and would never say no. These are two, Tom Brokaw called it the greatest generation, and they are among the greatest individuals in the greatest generation. I had the opportunity with John Tuck there a few years ago to work with them and dealing with some tough issues out at the national laboratories. And it was to hear them trade war stories from their long political careers. It was a wonderful experience, and I'll never forget it, and I'll always treasure it. It reminded me of, I saw a picture once of these two Galapagos tortoises talking to each other, and the one said to the, he says, you know, that Darwin was a nice guy. I also want to thank just think about it. It'll come to you. I want to thank both the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, which has just done such a fabulous job over the years under Lee Hamilton's leadership in bringing people together, and the somewhat newer but already very well established and respected Howard H. Baker Jr. Center for Public Policy for hosting this conference. And I did not know, actually, when I accepted, because I just accepted on the basis of the names, how apt and timely it was. And I want to thank my esteemed British colleague for yielding. And I learned a lot in that brief introduction about how we need to be thinking about the problems that we face. We have a problem now, and the reason why I was so eager to accept the challenge when I was invited by Secretary Chu to join him in the department, of a convergence of climatic threats, of national security threats, of energy security threats, and moving from where we are to a clean economy with sustainable sources of energy in a way that we're safe, and that our agriculture is safe, and that our coastal preservation interests are secured, is a challenge that I don't think anyone has seen bettered or in a greater need than we have today. And we need, in that respect, a decision and a decision-making process that comes out of a much broader set of considerations than we are customary to using. And that's why the kind of processes that we were just hearing about a few minutes ago are so apt. The best way to do this is we need to have an open process, a transparent process, a process that allows all stakeholders to get their views out and to have some form, some vehicle in which to exchange views, and then to base decisions not on preconceptions and biases, but on facts and dispassionate analysis. President Obama understands the importance of getting this right. He has said that the nation that leads the world in creating new sources of clean energy will be the nation that leads the 21st century global economy. That's the nation I want America to be. A lot of times you'll hear Secretary Chu say the reason why Wayne Gretzky was such a great hockey player was because when you asked him, he told you, I go where the puck is going, not where it is. We have to see where that puck is going, and people in this room are part of that process. I have worked, had the pleasure and honor of working in a number of administrations. I've never seen the degree of focus and attention and analytical rigor that we're now getting to this. It is a hardy perennial to say we need to reduce dependence on foreign oil. Every president going back at least to Nixon and probably beyond that, but certainly to Nixon, has made that an objective. And here we are today still importing roughly 60% of our oil. We've got to break that cycle. And I think now we have a chance to do that. I would just like to, in the brief time I have with you, talk about a few examples of how and where we're trying to do this. One, I had the opportunity to speak to this forum before. One of the subjects we've addressed here, and that I'll start with, is nuclear power. I firmly believe that we have to, in looking at the climate change equation, examine all sources of energy. I learned a lot from the 2003 MIT study, probably many of you have read, that said customarily we have looked at the question of energy supplies as saying, do we want to solve our energy problems with hydrocarbons or renewables or conservation or nuclear? And in 2003, the MIT study concluded the answer is yes. All the ors turn into ands. We're going to use hydrocarbons and renewables and energy efficiency and nuclear. If we continue on a business as usual path, we're going to see climate change potentially on the order of 4 to 5 degrees centigrade in this century. This brings the specter, and it's a ragged edge and it's an imperfect science, of the possibility of hitting a climatic tipping point, at which point even if we went to zero emissions, there'd be so much carbon baked into the atmosphere that we would face droughts where we now don't have them, that you would lose alpine forests, that you would have all manner of flooding, losing large areas of population to rising seas. And this is not a world that any of us wants to see. And I don't see any particular reason to see how close we can get to that tipping point without passing it. I don't see, and I don't believe the MIT study found evidence to support, that we can find a way to avert that degree of climate change without a significant deployment of nuclear energy. This country already relies on nuclear for 1/5 of our electricity and for 70% of our carbon-free emissions. We've got to tackle this problem. We've got to figure out how to do it smart. We do need to deal with the waste problem. We need to make sure the proliferation threats are minimized. But I don't think that we get to the future we want without having a significant deployment of nuclear. So I'd like to see nuclear move into the era of, if you will, post-politics. Secondly, I'm going to take advantage of Mr. Mabee by basically piggybacking on his remarks, where he was analyzing how various assumptions like we need new fishermen get played in. We can't afford any longer the kind of world in which we allow some of our prejudices about how things ought to be trump our judgment about how things need to be. And in doing so, a good example of this, frankly, is Secretary Chu, who really comes at this issue from a very focused perspective. Everything we're doing in the department can be distilled down to the objectives of seeing us get to a lower carbon future. And we are making tough decisions, and we'll be making tough decisions every day in terms of the budget, in terms of where we're making our investments, in trying to find the solutions that work. We will not know ahead of time what solutions will work. But I think what we need to be dedicated to is an honesty in the process that allows us to look at a wide variety of technical options, analyze them, see which ones will go to market, and then pursue them with great energy. Now, he comes out of the environment of Bell Laboratories, and it was I can tell from having spent a lot of time with him now, a formative experience for him. And what they were internally was ruthless with their own scientific inquiry, and they would start 10 projects, and as soon as one of them looked like it wasn't going to go, they'd cut it and move to something else. We need to be that nimble, we need to be that agile, and we need to be that dedicated to a scientifically driven and not politically driven process of developing new technologies and finding energy solutions. I'd like to point to another example some of you may be familiar with already. At the Department of Energy, we have the Energy Information Administration. There are certain, and it's not the only one, the Bureau of Labor Statistics comes to mind, there are certain repositories of intellectual integrity in the United States government. We need to hang on to those and keep them honest, because that is going to be the metric by which we measure our performance and measure our results. One of my former bosses says, if you don't measure it, you don't manage it. The EIA, as most of you know, is an independent agency within the Department of Energy. We can ask them questions, but we can't put a thumb on the scales in terms of their results. And what they report to us, they report to Congress, and that's as it should be. They have always made a contribution to our energy debates, and they will continue to do so. For example, the EIA has evaluated the impact of a renewable energy standard of 25%. And the EIA found that this would have a minimal impact on power prices, but it would reduce carbon emissions immediately. We also asked the EIA to update their annual energy outlook to gauge the rough impact of the Recovery Act. Now, again, as many of you know, the Department of Energy does many things besides energy, and ironically, energy has sometimes been not the largest part of its activities. We have responsibility for the defense complex, we have responsibility for the legacy of many of the Manhattan Project facilities, and we have a tremendous responsibility to invest in science. But on top of the $24 billion that the Department of Energy had in terms of budget for the 2010 year, we've now had $38 billion in Recovery Act funds added. And the analysis that the EIA provided indicated that wind generation by 2012 will more than double what it would have been without the Recovery Act. We have now asked the Energy Information Administration to analyze the Waxman-Markey legislation. I think with a bill of that kind of complexity, it's enormously important, again, to have this rigorous analytical process that is intellectually honest to make sure that we make the investments we need to make and we don't end up in the wrong place. And that brings me to my final example, which is the Recovery Act itself. The Recovery Act made a down payment on a clean energy future with incentives that could bring tremendous changes through weatherization, through block energy grants, and to pick up a tremendous amount of energy savings through building efficiency. Secretary Chu likes to say that energy efficiency, it's not low-hanging fruit, it's fruit that's lying on the ground. All you have to do is put insulation in an attic or some very modest investments. By the way, these investments bring jobs and a lot of communities that need jobs, and you can save thousands of dollars in energy bills very quickly. The payback period can be less than a year, and the savings can go on for decades. In pursuing the Recovery Act implementation, Secretary Chu has defined 4 key objectives: to get good projects underway quickly, B, in a way that creates lasting value, C, with an unprecedented degree of transparency, and D, in a way that makes a significant down payment on the nation's energy and environmental future. This is not a Washington-only project. We have been and will continue to consult with states and localities, and I am pleased to inform you, if you don't know, that of the $32.7 billion that the Congress has allocated for this purpose, $30 billion have been identified in terms of projects against which to place those dollars, and we're working very hard to move from identification to actual costing of these projects. We are holding ourselves, and we need to hold ourselves accountable to the American people. One of my colleagues at the DOE told me that we had 2 failure modes on the Recovery Act funding. One is not to get the money out the door, and 2 is not to get the money out the door wisely. And we are providing for peer reviews on projects. We are ensuring that we have auditing standards and that we are making sure that the people inside the department who are entrusted with the auditing function are sufficiently staffed so that they can make sure that these Recovery Act expenditures are done wisely and well. If we don't get that right, we will lose the trust of the American people, and we will not be able to continue to make the investments that we need to secure our energy future. I think it's also important to remember that, again, Washington is not the alpha and omega of finding the solution sets. The way we conceive of our role is in laying the basis and providing the seed corn to see where you might make these investments that then, hopefully, quickly will convert to private sector investments that will end up, through their own revenue streams, being both profitable, job generating, and getting us to the clean energy future that we need. The work that we're doing here is very important. the work that you're doing here is very important. I had the opportunity earlier today to hear from Scott Campbell and Senator Baker about some of the modeling and simulation work that's being done. This is critically important in two dimensions. Number one, as we were talking a few minutes ago, to have a fact-based analytical approach to this is absolutely essential. So to have modeling and simulation that allows everybody here, to tweak the variables and see if you go this much up in geothermal, that much down to hydro, if you make an investment in weatherization, if you make an investment in nuclear or whatever it might be, how does that play through our economic models? How does it play through our climate change models? And it's important not only because that will provide us the analytical basis for wise decision making, but it will also bring all the stakeholder communities involved. So I think it's actually impossible to exaggerate the importance of the mission that you all are embarked on here in terms of trying to think through how to get this analysis done in a way that is robust against a variety of assumptions and still keeps focused on those ultimate objectives: a low-carbon future, new energy forms, reduced dependence on foreign hydrocarbons, and all in a way that preserves our national security. So even as we proceed down these roads, that we can have a safe and secure future, and one that we can leave as stewards for the next generation and have been proud for the effort that we made on their behalf. Our parents all left us with a world better than the one we inherited, and I think we could do no better than to try to emulate that and do the same for our children. So I apologize. I deeply apologize. I was very excited to hear the last part of that, but I learned a lot from the part I did hear, and I appreciate the indulgence of Mr. Mabee, and I want to thank again our hosts, the Wilson Center, the Baker Center, and Lee Hamilton and Howard Baker, truly great Americans, and thank you all very much for your time.
Oh, yes.
I'll go down here.
Nick, could we call you back up? Nick, again, let me thank you for being so gracious, and it gave me a chance to jot down a couple questions about those fishermen when we get to that.
Yeah, don't tell them what I say. Now we'll move on to the related issue of correctional services and prisons, somehow related to fisheries in many ways. Just kidding. Very quick. This was an interesting project. It was basically motivated by the fact that we were spending too much on prisons and we couldn't afford it. But the pressures kept on rising and no one knew why. We kept on locking up more people. And so this is a classic piece of systems work. The main issue is that the courts are the drivers. Funnily enough, the courts are the people who sentence people. The judiciary is independent. But actually, if you look in the UK at different kinds of courts, and this is between two levels, what we call magistrates' courts and crown courts, that say for burglary, actually the sentencing reflects the court, not the crime. So there's something going on here about the people who make us do the sentencing and what they're doing rather than what the criminals are doing. And what it turns out is actually it's interaction between the media, the politicians, and the certain type of courts. And the courts with a higher public profile, who were close to the politicians, were sentencing much more severely than before. And the problem about that is that would be great if it worked, but it didn't work for a couple of reasons. Firstly, they didn't pay anything. So they were sentencing people. It didn't cost the courts a penny. They could just carry on spending more and more money. No, there's not enough places in the jails, build another jail, not my budget. I'm just the upholder of justice. Well, interesting. Nobody else gets a free ride like that on no cost. So the first one was there was no feedback in cost terms. And actually, the cost effectiveness of what we do with prisoners, such as referring people to drug programs as opposed to locking them up, varies enormously. And this is a cost-benefit ratio between different outcomes. And you find prison kind of goes right down the bottom, basically, as opposed to most of the kind of softer and less publicly acceptable programs. And this is to be very familiar to most politicians. So we ended up in this demand, this vicious circle of crisis that basically we had an increased sentencing severity that led to the resources being stretched. So how do we deal with not having enough places in prisons? We release people early. And who notices we've released people early? The media, who then say, you've released people early. So the courts say we must make longer sentences because we're releasing people early. So surely the right way to deal with that is making the prison sentence longer. So you can see where this particular system led to spending more money with no guarantee it was going to produce any outcomes, such as reducing offending, increasing public safety, reducing harm to the public. And I think this, especially in such a politically and emotionally and publicly charged area, this was quite critical because it combined modelling and cost modelling. There's a lot of cost data about how much you would save if you moved to a different model, but a lot of qualitative analysis about the influence of the media on different decision makers in the system, which really helped to break out, it came up, existing preconceptions about what was going on. Because again, if you looked at the information going to decision makers, they were really relying on anecdotal decision making, and most of the information coming from their civil servants or analysts wasn't analysing the system; it was analysing different pieces of the puzzle, but not the whole system. So it was really important to give essentially the ministers a grip on the decision, which was their job, because nobody underneath them had a grip on the whole system, and that happens over and over again. One of the questions we used to ask ourselves is, if we look at the strategy, and this is the decision we need to make, who is empowered to make that decision? Where in government can we see a committee or a minister or a part of parliament who actually can control all the pieces? And quite often it just doesn't exist. So everybody trundles along in their own little way, doing a good job, adding up to a bad result. And none of them are empowered to change the system, except the Prime Minister in our system, which was why that was our job, was to say, look, you're setting yourselves up for failure, and no matter what you will do, we're not saying you're doing a bad job, you cannot produce a good outcome with a system that's set up like this. Taking a big leap away from domestic policy into international and foreign policy, this is interesting. It's the first time I think analysts had been led into the foreign policy area, and they didn't do another project like this for 5 years because we caused such a degree of cultural difference. Anyway, so it was an interesting example, especially as I'd worked in the Foreign Office before. I actually carried an audit of UK foreign policy in 2003 for the Cabinet, and we identified that we were really bad at dealing with failing states. Well, we haven't actually improved a lot since then, I must admit, given Afghanistan. I was involved in at some point. And we published a report called Investing in Prevention in 2005. And why did we do this? Because if you look at all of the UK's priorities, from weapons of mass destruction to terrorism to poverty reduction, 40 to 60% of the countries involved are at high risk of instability. So there's no point pursuing a great anti-terrorism policy in a country where the government is constantly destabilised. The context you're working in isn't there, but there was no one actually in charge of this stability issue. And whenever you looked at the cost-benefit ratio of preventing war to letting it happen, it's a pretty good investment. It's not subprime. There's some 400 to 600% returns on those interventions. And there was a story out there. There was a story about why this wasn't happening. It was called Political Will. When in doubt, blame politicians. Another lesson I've learned from all this work. They blamed the politicians for fisheries. Actually found out it wasn't the politicians' fault at all. But they were the easiest ones to blame, and no one believes a politician if they say it's not their fault. So lack of political will is a primary cause of uninvestment in prevention and slow response to early crisis. And there are political will, but political will is a complex beast. You can have a clash of interests. You can have the costs and benefits of the action don't add up. None of us went to Congo when it had a huge war. And there's a perceived lack of public support. Are these legitimate causes of lack of political will or illegitimate causes? So we looked across our decision support systems from the intelligence to the highest level of decision making and said, how do you see what's going on? And what we found was that actually the senior decision makers didn't use the £3 billion we spent on official decision support from our intelligence services. They used The Economist and the Financial Times as their major driver of action, which was a pretty big break in your system. And then when they were presented with solutions for a country that was going to crisis, they didn't believe they would work, didn't believe we could do them, and so they would say, I think we won't do it this time. So was that a lack of political will or a lack of faith in the system they were controlling actually produced decent scenarios? So, and why was this true? Well, partly it's because it's complicated. This is trends of conflicts in Africa. Why? They go up, they go down. They're not random. But why is that happening? There's loads of people who say, I understand why conflict happens. Statistical model. Well, yes and no. Nobody in foreign policy believes any of this rubbish because they believe stories. They don't believe statistics. They only explain, if you believe them, 25 to 50% of conflict, so that's not really a lot. So contested, difficult to use. Low incomes, they've come up with correlations. Low incomes are associated with, poverty is associated with conflict. Well, which way does that causality go? Is it countries with conflicts are poor, or poor people fight more? Actually, we can't tell you because it's too complicated to measure. And it didn't help support the decisions we made. And it was very critical because if you looked at what we need to do to solve the problems, which we were better at understanding, if we'd done good things like Bosnia and other places, Sierra Leone, some good experiences, then we need to do lots of things lots of time. So in the really short term, crunchy decision making, sending in the military, building systems, humanitarian support, macroeconomic crisis support. But then you need to have the people in place to do that, so you have to contingency plan and put things in place through preventive diplomacy for the kind of 2 years before the crisis. And before that, you have to build the forces, reorganise your structures, build aid programmes, strengthen regional militaries. And even before that, 10 years in advance, you have to decide you're going to have the capability to go somewhere, or to deploy a police force, or to actually build a regional. So it's a very difficult set. You have to have a systematic approach so you can build the capability to respond. This is very influenced by military capability planning, because we worked a lot with them, but it's to do peace. It's to do peace building and stop having to send our boys abroad. Boys and girls abroad. That's the basic rationale. They're expensive and they get killed, and we don't want to do it, and so we should do peace better. So I thought I was quite emotionally involved in this one because I was quite shocked at how bad we were at doing this, how good we are at sending our soldiers abroad. The systems to do the military intervention were brilliant. The systems to do the peace building were awful, and that was wasting, lives and money and causing human suffering. I thought it was this unacceptable system failure. This is a system we drew up for Nigeria, though it's not written on it. Didn't go down very well in the foreign policy community, wasn't that useful. We went back to the drawing board. We couldn't come in and they didn't think this way. So we said, how do we deal with these people? They don't deal with things the way we deal with them. So we did a lot of analysis of threats, fine. We talked to a lot of people in the US and Germany and the EU about how they were doing it. Everybody was undergoing a system reform process at the time as well. And we just said, well, let's do it. And we piloted 3 live case studies of foreign policy through the UK system against sometimes great resistance. Where instead of this being given to the Foreign Office to run, it was given to us to run. And we came in and said, what's the problem? And if people came up with analysis we didn't like, we said, go back and do it again. That's not very good. Which is not normal. Certainly in the British system, we do consensus, we don't do competition. There's a bit more competition in the US system. So once we made enough enemies from that process, actually the great thing was, and we worked with the people at the sharp end, the people who were out in the field on boats, catching drug smugglers, dealing with terrorists, they loved this. So they said, we don't want to go in for 6 months and get a success, pile of cocaine, bad guys caught. But no, we'll be back in 5 years' time doing it all over again because there is no plan for following it up. So the biggest supporters were from the people at the sharp end who really got this. And the biggest detractors were the people who had to change their budgets and their programs and stuff in the central headquarters who didn't want to move. And so our recommendations weren't so much about policy, but about how we structured the government and manuals for developing better strategies for decision makers. And we invented a systems model, a very, very simple systems model that has 5 elements because people can only remember 5 things. And this has been tested with lots of people in the field, and it just says, if you're trying to understand why a country goes into instability, you have a central issue about its capacity. You have to look at the risks that come into it, the shocks that affect it, how external stabilising factors can happen, and when violence erupts, it feeds back into resentment and grievance. And we use this to run workshops with everybody from the Secret Intelligence Service to development agency people in one room to build a picture of what was going on. Because we didn't have a tool to bring the community together to come up with a joint strategy. That was what it was for. And they kept on trying to complicate it. We said, no, it can't be more complicated. This has to be the thing we use. You can then make lots of detail around it, but it has to, in the end, be a simple thing. And you can talk, that's normal. If you have risks increase, that goes great, a little bit of conflict. Oh dear, with conflicts broken out, we can intervene to halt the crisis, and then we stabilise it. It looks simple. It's meant to be simple, but it's actually very meaningful because it captures every important dynamic. And you ask the question, okay, fine, that's a wonderful intelligence report. What does it mean? Does it mean the risks are big relative capacity or small? Oh, I don't know. Well, then it's not a useful intelligence report. Go and find intelligence that tells me what's useful to me, whether I go to the minister and say we've got to intervene or not. And then there's a whole manual you can find us on the website which says how you do this in a lot of detail. So the lesson from that was really new tools and institutions can really help overcoming political failures, because a lot of things that people blame on politicians are actually system failures. And we had to work and keep credibility with our stakeholders all the way through, because they really did not think in this way. And yeah, to be brutally honest in this room, we got enormous pushback, and the head of the Civil Service and Foreign Office tried to kill the project at multiple stages, and at the last stage dealt us kind of semi-fatal blow. I went back in 4 years ago with the new Foreign Secretary to help red team his new strategy on conflict prevention, and our slides were still being used by the head of conflict prevention, who had been one of the leaders of trying to kill the project. So, yeah, again, you don't necessarily win these battles the first time round, but doing really structured systemic analysis, working into organisations, it was incredibly valuable, and we also call them slow burn projects. You don't not win the first battle, but you change the way people think about a problem, and as champions move forward and it helps create something that works. And this was a major public sector reform project, which we're still moving forward on, and Afghanistan is the next big test, and I'm involved in some ways in that in the UK. It's really important. And the problem here was we were not taking it seriously enough as a public policy issue. Last one, energy and climate security. This is a bit of history, so you can see how things have changed. 2003, we wrote an energy white paper when climate change was coming up the agenda fast, but wasn't as a larger priority as it is now. And we were looking to balance 4 objectives of UK energy policy: security, environment, competitiveness, social. Huge fight about whether environment was first among equals or one of all. That just shows you that was a different time. And for the UK, really, we'd done energy policy was an economic imperative for 20 years, and we were very national because we had lots of oil and gas, and we didn't have any imports. But now we were heading into a decline of our resources, so lots of fears about energy security coming up. And on the basis of this, we said we'll cut domestic goal, 60% reductions. A pathway for that's fine, and then a challenge to build a process to move that forward. Without overcommitting or overinvestment. A lot of worry about overinvesting in new technology. Unfortunately, that meant it didn't work. So I came back in 2005 to review the failure of being off our target growth, and we realised that we weren't managing the projects right, its implementation and strategy was wrong, and we realised that we needed a much better system for managing our carbon budget and our overall innovation processes around it, and a way of managing risk, and particularly around new technologies, and what the route map for moving forward was, something the Secretary was talking about. What's the route map for getting there? We were very complacent. We thought the market would deliver everything with a bit of price. It just wasn't happening in practical terms. And this is a bit of history, because this is what I presented to the Prime Minister. How are we going to get there? Energy efficiency, renewables, a new grid. Fuel cells and hydrogen were really big then. It looks like anachronistic now, just shows how fashion's changed. But hydrogen was the big thing, not electric cars. We need to build a hydrogen grid, and then we can use lots of things in 2050. That's fine. That's it. Do that and you're fine. Except it doesn't really work like that, does it? And this is the bit I didn't get to present to the Prime Minister, because advisors told me he didn't need to know this, which was basically, it's really quite uncertain. The actual phrase was, "Dear boy, the Prime Minister doesn't need to know this," when we were doing the final edit of the slide pack. And basically, some technologies won't arise. Will we get nuclear that's non-proliferation proof? Will we get CCS? Will we get cheap solar? I don't know, wouldn't put my mortgage on any of them. We know new scientific evidence is likely to show climate change is more damaging. Well, it already has, so I was right. It will get even worse. I think it still holds. Basically, the cheapness of technologies will be determined by global markets. Not even the US is big enough to drive technology. It's a global issue. Even the EU is a bigger economy than the US, isn't large enough to drive technology in lots of these areas. And we may see a lot faster growth in developing countries. They haven't even started using cars in China yet at a serious level. There are some surprises out there that we're not putting in our models. So we need to have a hedging strategy. So the hedging strategy is more technology, but then we're caught in what we called the carbon catch-22, and this became the signal kind of UK issue. We don't know, decision makers don't know whether it's feasible to reach this target, so we set fuzzy reduction goals we can kind of pull back from later on, but the technologies will only arrive if there's clear markets for them, because you can't just chuck R&D at things and expect them to get to market. They're just too big and complicated, and the companies will only invest if future markets are certain enough. And some options in, say, investment in systems and grid could appear redundant if you get the wrong innovations. So a fear of being seen to pick winners and a desire to put lots of risk on the private sector meant that no one was investing in anything. And actually, and the industry would come in and say, we want certainty. And then the next day, when there's a small spike in oil price, say, we want flexibility. And the decision makers go, what do I do? Flexibility and certainty. They aren't the same. You can't just have both. But people would come up with policy statements saying, we need certainty in long-term carbon price and the flexibility to respond to, you can't have both. But you need to get out of the catch-22 and move to a virtuous circle where decision makers make credible targets and can pull things through markets, but not for every market and on everything. And that's where, again, you have to get beyond these sweeps of the market versus the state to much more granular analysis of how individual supply chains work, individual technologies work. And the lesson really was that, especially in the UK, where we had this big legacy of a very kind of laissez-faire approach in the government, that we couldn't duck making investment choices. We couldn't make the companies make all the choices. We actually had to take, it's a public good, energy and climate security are public goods. The public authorities in some shape if they want them delivered on time, they have to make some choices. And the question is, given the uncertainty about policy and fuel prices and fuel availability, what choices should we make and what things we leave to the market, and being very pragmatic about that and about what works. And that's where the role of systematic analysis became really important. What happened post this, as we went through another set of reviews and another energy review, which seemed to be failure, and the market still did not respond. There was no credibility in the investment market on our renewables target, on our decarbonisation target. And so what happened is we put in an act called the Climate Change Act, which followed recommendations we'd come up with in 2003 on institutional reform but hadn't got through, which said our target for the future, which is now 80% reductions by 2050, is legally binding. And there is an independent committee analogous to the central bank, to our interest rate setting committee, that sets carbon budgets to meet that and also comments whether you're on or off target. And this committee has said, no, decarbonise your power sector by 2035, UK. No coal power stations without CCS, UK. So they're not just commenting on numbers, they're commenting on real policy. And we're in the response to that committee. It's an advisory committee, but has very huge public authority, because it's independent, it's got an analytical capability, has direct connections to Parliament and to government, and it's to hold the government to account to its own decision. And I think it's a really important advance in moving this forward. And especially because it's got the analytical capability to really speak truth to power. So this is a real innovation, I think, that takes into account this whole issue of credibility and expectations and starts, as we have with the markets and the interest rates, starts really making something real. So those are the examples. What do we do going forward? And these are just a couple of ideas about what we need to do. The British invented muddling through as a way of running an empire. Worked for a bit. Didn't work for a bit after that. It's a very powerful part of British culture that anything that looks a little bit complicated and overstructured is it's just not very British. Especially in the civil service and especially in foreign policy, I'll tell you that. So motivating doing things a little bit more explicitly is quite hard work, I think, in any organisation. But I think this climate change in particular really requires us to move beyond muddling through. It's the time frame. We have to achieve change in a certain time frame. Muddling through tends to go with the flow of how generational change in institutions moves forward. We can't afford that type of slow change. It's much more like Second World War. We need something on time. We can't wait for the Spitfire to evolve. We have to have them now because the Germans are coming. It's more that attitude. And to drive intentional change, you have to win arguments. You can't just wait for your opponent to die off or get retired, which is still the last. When we did the countries at risk work, I did a presentation to the Chief of Staff Command course in the UK, which is the highest level training course for the next Chiefs of Staff. And they said, we understand, you're slightly frustrated that we're not doing this, and we agree with you. Don't worry, wait till those old guys go, we'll come in and change it. They were offering me a generational change solution and said, we won't win the argument, but we can, don't worry, we'll win it on a turnover. We can't afford that, it's too slow. So we need to drive intentional change, so we need to really have explicit understanding of drivers, constraints, blockages, uncertainties, so we have debates. And I think that's the core driver here. You could do it another way, but you wouldn't get the result in the time you need it. And you need to build new institutions between policy communities, bridge those gaps intentionally to build the places. And so for us, the biggest challenge for tackling climate change is not technology. We have great systems for generating technology. And it's not finance. We have great systems for generating money, and we've got lots of money, even with the financial, loads of money. It's institutional. We've got really bad models for changing institutions, intentionally, over time. That's the big constraint. And so where do I think we should focus? Some communities to bring together. Energy and climate security. I've been talking to both communities for years. They do not understand each other. They do not believe in the same things. They are actively avoiding talking to each other in most countries, especially when it's to do with pipeline politics in Europe. There needs to be bringing them together to get integrated policies to drive investment that's consistent. You have so many inconsistencies now between those two communities. And if you're going to get a new grid, you have to make sure you know what you're building it for, and that's what they hold. Finance. Most governments do not understand at all why people invest, or why financial institutions invest, or what they're doing, and how they look at risk, and how they're looking at government policy. If we're going to get the money to flow, we have to get better understanding them, and they have to get better at understanding where the policy is going. I talked to large banks, and they didn't know the basic policy future. They were investing in things that I was about to outlaw. And they didn't know really, I mean, perhaps it's better here, but I don't think it is. So innovation policy mentioned, yes, we will create lots of new jobs for ourselves, but we also need the Chinese to own, manufacture and export low-carbon technologies. One, because their companies will decarbonise China, not our companies. We'll have a bit of the market, but they're going to do most of it. Who's going to produce the technology for India and Africa? They're probably going to buy our stuff. It's too complicated, too expensive, requires too well-governed a system. The Chinese technologies are probably much likely to be more appropriate for those markets, and we need them to go quickly. So, yes, we got lots of benefits and opportunities, but let's think about how we have to cooperate with others to generate the things we need, cheaper, faster, better, and let them have a slice. Because, again, China will not decarbonise if it doesn't think it's going to get a slice of the low-carbon economy. If it thinks that we're excluding it from those opportunities, China and India will not join up. There's space in it for everybody. It's a big opportunity. It's really replacing Saudi oil with clever people from various countries. So there's a lot of space for all of us, and we can't get caught in too nationalistic a debate. Well, perhaps that's what you say on the hustings. But in the policy world, this cooperation on technology and understanding how it relates to national competitiveness is critical, and that involves communities. And the last one is understanding how climate change impacts on security and making sure we know how to manage those security risks. So those are communities we need to bring together to make discussions on what they need to discuss. They need to discuss low-carbon infrastructure investment. How do we build the power grid capable of delivering zero emissions by 2030? Transport planning, technology policy and competition, resilience planning. Lots of issues we're going to cover later on, but these are the type of policy dilemmas we need to drive forward. And really important, market creation. We're trying to create totally new markets with new entrants, new areas. We want disruptive entrants. We want incumbents. High energy efficiency building supply. Haven't got the business. The business doesn't exist now. How do we build a business? Retrofit energy efficiency. Weatherizing sounds great, but you try doing it. We're trying to do 20 million houses in the UK over 10 to 20 years, depending on the decision we make this year. We haven't got an industry to do it. How do we do it cost effectively? That doesn't exist. Whose job is it? Active smart grid business models. Who makes smart grids? Who does it in a liberalised system? Fine in a utility system, not so good in the kind of system we have across Europe. Scalable business models on CCS, low carbon infrastructure and construction. It goes on, but these are some of the ones we're working on. Let's make the new markets. So, finishing. Okay, what's this add up to? Lots of stuff. What counts as success? Things are unpredictable, they're messy, they're political. What counts as success? Better informed crises, actually, is a pretty good line. Getting things done, but also managing the unexpected well. Pasteur's quote, "Chance only favours a prepared mind," is a great piece of wisdom. And again, is a justification. Yes, I might not know the future, but if I don't prepare for futures, I won't know how to manage it. That's critical. And we need to get the demand. The problem is not the supply of thinking, it's the demand for thinking from the people who make decisions. That's the side that needs to be worked on, to show why this works, why it adds value, and why it's more useful. And yes, there will be politics. Politics are not an excuse for not doing this. You can use systems to make your political strategies a lot better. And understanding informal decision-making is as important as this stuff. And we do this all the time, and we think there's a lot of ways to do it. And this is my last slide, because this still sums up everything I've just said, much more pithily than I could ever do. From Oliver Wendell Holmes, I would not give a fig for the simplicity this side of complexity. However, I would give my life for the simplicity on the other side of complexity. It's easy to be complicated. It's easy to be complex. What's really hard is turning that into simple but not simplistic things you can communicate to people who have to make real decisions in real time, in real political context. That, for me, is the most exciting intellectual challenge and people challenge you can get. And it's not demeaning or spinning or turning things down. It's doing something we need to be better at to solve these problems. And that's the end of my talk. I've stolen your watch.
Oh, you've got that. You'll take some questions?
Yeah.
We are blessed. Mr. Mabee will be delighted to take some questions. I must say that has stirred my thinking. And his comment about the simplicity after complexity made me think, I believe it was Prince Kropotkin who once said that if you really understand something, you can explain it to the simplest Russian peasant. So that's partly the challenge you've laid before us. Can we really understand what we're doing and where we're going? Well, please, let's open it up for questions, and if you could then just identify yourself. And we have a microphone. Who would like to lead us off? So the gentleman here. The microphone is just coming there.
Dan Cameron, UC Berkeley. Nick, I'll avoid the fishery, crime, energy jokes, which actually could actually fill a whole show. But one question on the sort of creating industry basis. I mean, right now we're seeing the excitement of flooding the world with public sector money on energy. But I think that most people suspect that in the long term, these solutions really have to become core businesses in the private sector side. And maybe there'll be some debate about that. But you sort of alluded to the lack of companies in some of these areas to fulfill the smart grid, the retrofit, number of the industries in the UK. What about the kind of the game-changing ways that governments can actually open the door, whether it's regulation, whether it's seeding a couple companies? There's a mythology in the U.S. around Semitech and the process to do public-private enterprises. Views on Semitech's actual versus discussed history vary. But what about the not just the UK, but the EU versions of that sort of, not the 1 or 2% changes, but the things where government can really initiate really game-changing, positive tipping points on the commercial side?
Okay. No, I totally agree, and this is one of the areas where one of the things I've noticed going through is that it's not countries have different competitive advantage in their governance systems relative to these problems. It's not that their governance systems are changing that fast. It's that the changing in the problems has made the French system actually rather better than the UK system, which wasn't true 10 years ago, because the French system is better at making strategic decisions and public-private partnerships than the UK system, just by its internal culture. So one of the most interesting models, I think, for precisely this kind of new market creation is in the Nordics, where you're seeing an alliance between the Nordic countries and a network of cities, with a network of electric vehicle suppliers, including Saab and Volvo, where cities will put in the electric charging infrastructure and a good tax regime associated with a volume of supply for a strategic industry goal of making the Nordics a leader in electric car production. And they've got the social permission to do it and to do the policy. So they're playing off their social capital and their industrial capital to try and position themselves in the industry. One of the areas which we worked on in the UK was precisely this issue about who's going to create the new building technologies for the future, because buildings are a very strange institution, especially big buildings, because a project developer who's basically a land speculator comes together, assembles a bunch of people around a project, that's the consumer, and builds it really quickly and tries to sell it really quickly, usually at a certain point in the business cycle, and has very little interest in quality, has very little interest in driving innovation, or can't drive innovation down the supply chain particularly well. Not like a car company. Can't say, I want a building that has this kind of spec. Or no interest, because its real money is from timing and land prices and positioning. So how do you then get that supply chain to start producing much better quality housing? Well, we were looking at 10 eco-towns in the UK, new towns which had different specifications linked to industrial policy, and essentially a new set of stretch regulations that all UK houses will have to be zero carbon by 2016. All French houses will have to be positive energy by 2019, and all German houses, I think, have to be zero energy by around 2020, or passive house by 2020. This is the most anti-competitive, oligarchic, corrupt market in the EU. And that's just to show the number of infringement things against building firms and construction firms. So it's been very interesting to see how, given we've started to create a market for these really innovative products, whether we start to see DG competition going around and breaking open national monopolies for building and letting the best suppliers, which are probably from Sweden and Nordics, come in and compete vigorously across Europe. We may be writing letters to them suggesting this might be something they may want to do. But that's how you can see things like competition policy, I think, become really important when you're driving these transitions. Unusual places for environmentalists to go. But they end up being, along with the incentives, these issues like that become critical in the next phase.
Do I hear a hankering for performance contracts in that statement?
They have. I mean, there's lots of different tools out there, and I think they suit different places. Where the way people seem to be going now are, kind of building regulations and which are written in, when you go to the detail, more or less fuzzy ways. And this is the thing: there's always wriggle room. And it's back to the carbon tax 22s. Are they firm enough, and will the building industry believe them enough that they'll actually produce a product to time? And at the moment, there's a bit of kind of, the recession's coming up. We could say it's all too expensive, and let's push back. Perhaps we can move the political boundaries instead of having to move the technological boundaries and the market boundaries. And that's not going to go away. Well, that's constantly going to be a battle on this. So we're going to learn which ones of how do we lock ourselves in to not stupid decisions. Which is, not that easy.
Mac Dessler there in the back, Professor Dessler.
Mac Dessler, University of Maryland. I may have missed it, or it may have been a product of the necessary intervention of Dan Poneman, but I don't recall you're taking us to what finally happened on either of your first two stories, the fisheries or the prisons. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about success, non-success, partial success in changing those systems, on one of those anyway, and then maybe draw some bridges to the energy environmental area.
I think the fishery. I'll do the fisheries one. It's the one I know intimately best. The fisheries one was very interesting. We won the support of the main ministers, except in Scotland, because for political reasons, the different party to the party in England. So they decided nothing that came out of London could at all be acceptable. The fact we got the major fisheries organisations to even partially back the report was such a monumental success. It's been the heart of the stakeholder process going forward. We managed to reform the whole way fisheries was structured in the UK. In departmental terms, we brought in recreational fishers into the outcome, which has diluted the role of commercial fishermen in the startups. We got the EU to change very slowly over time to a risk-managed regional fishery approach. It's just implemented now. And we persuaded the government, perhaps most importantly, the only message I took to the Secretary of State out of all this work was that fisheries is not steel. It can be a long-term sustainable business, and there's nobody who's going to compete it away from the UK shores. So it's worth spending some time on, because they were just crisis managing it. And there was a big increase in political effort to get the systems right, as opposed to just keeping the headlines down, which was all they were doing in the past. They integrated fisheries into the environment part of the department, marine environment. We have a Marine Act now. So not all of those were our initiatives, but we were the kind of fisheries heart of them. The absolute abject complete failure, dealing with the science community. We were told at the beginning not to deal with fisheries science. I was really warned off. This is the linchpin. Of course, it turned out it was the big problem, that they would write to the minister and say they had 10% confidence limits on their measurements, and they'd publish papers in academic journals saying they had 150% confidence limits. And when I challenged the chief scientists on this, and it's the biggest science establishment in the UK government, so 400 scientists, they said, well, it's not useful for the minister to know how uncertain they are. Which was, and this is a guy who pays his checks. And so we said they should introduce more innovation, more competition, like New Zealanders have done, allow innovative university groups to come together and bid, saying with new tools and technologies. They were using 1950s fish counting methods, with slide rules, basically. It was very bad. And we failed to win a single one of those battles. They convinced the government that taking one fisheries scientist away from the institute would destroy its critical mass. And so one lesson I learnt, beware white-coated bureaucrats. They are really good at resisting change.
Gentleman there, and then Professor Hill.
Hi, I'm Rao Kodamarti from Argonne National Lab. I would be interested to know how you dealt with the uncertainty in your complex models. This is one of the big issues for climate change and energy issues. So you showed some modeling you did for example, fisheries. How exactly did you deal with uncertainty in those things?
Most of the uncertainty, there are two stages. You come with lots of uncertainty. The question is it material in terms of it changing policy? And so, because sometimes it's not, it's just, you can keep the same policies and they will work across a range of uncertainty as long as there's enough flexibility. That's a very easy risk management model. The hardest risk management idea is when you actually have a real difference in the policy you would pursue inside the bounds of uncertainty. And the next question for us is, okay, we spend a lot of time in all of these sectors actually risk managing, saying, okay, well, who should control and manage that risk? Who's capable of doing it? And we take out each component of uncertainty and try and work out who was capable of managing it, and what residual risks a government would have to do, and whether it was something we could predict before time or after time. So was it truly complex and decentralized, or was it something we could have a good hit on? And so in the fisheries case, that came out with things, we wanted to put a lot more risk on the fishermen in terms of their control of their catch, but give them a lot, in a sense, going to involve them in managing the uncertainty around the fish stocks in a kind of co-scientific venture. But what you couldn't do is prescribe a management technique for each of the very different fisheries around the UK. And so one of the main things was decentralising to regional fisheries managers. So there was a named person in charge. So at the beginning it was, in central government, there was someone who ran the boats, someone who ran the fish, someone who ran the environment, someone who ran the fishermen support. All in separate bureaucracies dealing with the North Sea North, North Sea South, Scottish South, Irish Sea, Channel and South West, with 80 species of fish. And all very different environments. They didn't know anything, and they were bureaucrats who went there for 3 years. They didn't know anything, and no one thought they knew anything. So what we wanted is, we said, who do we phone up to manage, who manages the North Sea, and how do we phone them? Oh, nobody. Nobody manages the North Sea. Here's North Sea boats, here's North Sea fish. So we said, no, we need somebody who's in charge, who can then assemble and round the uncertainty, who people trust, because in the end, they're going to need to react to unforeseen circumstances and have the trust of people that are doing it in their business. So that high trust system was part of managing uncertainty, putting the person in charge close to the fishermen and the stocks, giving them enough resources to decide how to manage, and getting it out of the central government. So that's the kind of risk management. And then another piece of risk management. The other recommendation was that we just advised the government that the whole common fisheries policy was going to break down under climate change, and they should prepare for it. And we didn't know when it was going to happen, because it could happen in 5 years or 15 years or 25 years, but it was definitely going to happen, because the fish were going to move, and once the fish moved, the whole deal of splitting up the fish between the countries was going to break down, and politically the whole thing would collapse. And so the argument was, get the fleet and the regulation in a state they can survive that shock. It was one of our big arguments for why they should invest in reform earlier on. That was in the private report, not the public report. So those are some of the techniques. A lot of it revolves down into institutional design, who controls what risk. And the other one was very interesting for the climate change. We said, it's not the fishermen's fault if climate change happens. We need to have a strategy for compensation. The Treasury were not happy. The Treasury said, we didn't have many policies on climate change. What we found we did have was the government shall take no liability for climate change impacts at all. A very firm Treasury line they hadn't been saying to many people, because even though we had more control over minimising climate change than any other actor, we go to international negotiations, we run climate policy, it was, no, that's going to be an act of God, even though it's an act of man, because we don't want to have open-ended liabilities on this. So that was interesting that someone else had been managing uncertainty, but without telling anybody, really.
Chris?
I'm Chris Hill at George Mason University. I'm interested in the ideological position of the unit in the Prime Minister's office as an analytical advisory and support organization. You've used language like winning battles, and we didn't make that one, but we got this one, and we went back later and they were using our stuff and so on. An attitude toward the role of the analyst that's remarkably different from the avowed role in the U.S. system of a similar position group that would say, we discuss the alternatives, we elaborate the consequences, but we're not policymakers, we don't win or lose. That's something that happens in the political arena. You've described a much more organic process, and I wondered if you've reflected on that in comparison with what you've seen here in the junior colonies, and if you could offer us any advice, maybe we've been going down the wrong road with our separation of science and policy advice over these past decades, and I just wonder if you could comment on that.
There's a reason it's called the strategy unit and not the UK head of social science. There is a UK head of social science, there is a UK economic service, there is a statistics service, there are a load of people who are analysts and in the terms of the intelligence community, produce non-policy tainted analysis. That's not what the strategy unit was for. The strategy unit was to do long-term strategy on an evidence base, commissioned by cabinet, with departments and depending on the occasion, with or without stakeholders. So we were there to solve problems and to bridge where the evidence stops and the decision lands. And that was the real uniqueness. And it came out of some think tanks, to be honest. And they're thinking, although lots of places have this, it was the most elaborate piece of machinery that you could ever put in this place, and the most self-aware. It was saying you can throw good information at decision makers for ages, but that doesn't, it doesn't on its own help them make decisions. You have to understand its meaning. So things like, that's why we spend such a lot of time on systems, such a lot of time on risk management, such a lot of time on understanding stakeholders' views and how those were affecting the things. All the things that actually analysts feel very uncomfortable, pure analysts feel very uncomfortable doing. And because we were very evidence-based, and we certainly did speak truth to power, and it was slightly a personal attitude about how much truth you spoke to which power. We were in the political fight, and in the end, people would negotiate out our reports, and if we wanted to have a report that became government policy, you took a certain amount of concessions, and if you said, no, the report is going to be a report to government, you would keep it more pure. And that was a tactical decision which we would make with the Prime Minister about how far he was prepared to push the system, what the political conditions were outside with the report. So this was why we would think about this. Are we just trying to persuade, or are we becoming policy? Therefore, how much flexibility, what are the liabilities? So we're very much in the policy-making machine, but given enough authority and distance that we could tackle things which other people weren't, which is why I thought it was such a unique institution. And because the mix of full-time civil servants were diluted by people who were there, no one was doing it to further their career at my level. There's a kind of team of the people who were running senior advisory. We were doing it because we wanted to do it. And to be honest, when we went through a phase where it was do what the Prime Minister says and come up with the answer he wants, 80% of the people left to do other jobs because it just wasn't doing problem solving in a political context.